Sidestepping Patronage with Vulnerable Mission. So I've lived in Western Kenya 25 years, previously having been in Zambia for a while, on the basis of the conviction that one or two Westerners ought to have a deep understanding of what's going on in Africa and other parts of the world, in the interests of the gospel and in the interests of relations more generally. So some of the churches I work with, the big picture is my home church at an annual conference, and then one of the indigenous churches I visit. My ministry is basically Bible teaching using Swahili and Lua languages, plus children who I look after there at my home, and writing and research I also engage in, plus you could say informally some hospital ministry, where in my office I'm hosted by Coptic Orthodox Church. Vulnerable Mission, what is it? Westerners doing mission outside of the West, using indigenous languages and resources in ministry. So that in essence is what I find myself promoting when I'm in the Western world. Maybe in Africa we can't really talk about patronage because we are patronage, we white folks. And the other thing that's striking me that we have in Africa, which I'm not hearing about here in Lebanon, is we have mystical forces, where envy is interpreted mystically. Anyway, in this paper, I guess I'm going to state some things without full justification because of time restraints. So, Sidestepping Patronage with Vulnerable Mission. Part 1, the Alliance of Vulnerable Mission, a personal perspective. Amongst the things I learned, that was as a secondary school teacher of agriculture in Zambia, 88 to 91, regard the problems when Western missionaries who were in charge were also the donors, while using Western languages, and while because they're outsiders, they're ignorant of the context. I'd expected somehow missionaries and locals to be working hand in hand, and I found the communication was difficult. So I realized that as a foreign missionary, I needed to be vulnerable to the context. Hence, when moving to Kenya in '93, this time as a Bible teacher, previously as an agricultural teacher, I determined as far as possible, look, I need to do ministry using local resources, so I'm not buying people. Because if you buy people, they tell you yes. And also using local languages. So you can hear that discussion that's going on, even if you're not the one being targeted. The failure of other missionary initiatives to follow vulnerable mission principles, that is, local languages, local resources, appeared more and more crazy as the years went by. Why don't other folks get this? 2003 to 7, I wrote my PhD thesis. 2007, I made my first trip to the US to convince Americans about vulnerable mission. Expecting, oh, Jim, yes, that's it. We've got it, we're changing. But instead, heavy opposition. Not wanting, I guess, to listen. We founded the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission in 2007, local languages, local resources, for some Western missionaries. So we're not just everybody's patron, because a patron is someone you praise and tell good things to. Stan Nussbaum was a founder member, if Stan doesn't mind waving. And Chris Flanders was on our board. There you go. So we have a presence here of the Alliance of Vulnerable Mission. We've had conferences in the US, UK and Germany since then, usually without a large attendance. I've made trips to the US, visiting seminaries, Christian universities, sharing this message, usually 10 weeks, 10 to 15 seminaries, 2010, 2013, 2017. So I've been trying to kind of share this message. Because this conference is about patronage, I won't focus much on linguistic issues, but I was intrigued that the first presentation said, look, language is a key part of all this. And I think that's right. Adoption by African countries of European languages for education and official purposes makes them incredibly liable to domination by foreign patrons in unhealthy ways. So we look at both the resources and the language. The resources I interpret as being the patron issues. So I believe that awareness of linguistic issues is an important and necessary complement to awareness of patronage issues. Now, maybe in the Arabic-speaking world it's no big deal because Arabic is such a big, strong language, but our African languages aren't so big and strong, and most of them have just said, look, let's use English. Okay, vulnerable mission is about gifts. Debates tend to be recognized by key terms. So patronage is a key term here. It's related to gift giving. Now, in hindsight, those are key issues we've tried to address in the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission. Although those terms, I think we've rarely used. You know, that's one of the issues of scholarship, I guess. You can be having one debate here, and they're having the same debate, but using different terminology. So when I discovered this conference on patronage, I thought, yes, that seems to be bang on what we're trying to do. I acknowledge with Barclay, and I managed to read his tome, and Mauss, that Mauss has a foundational contribution to this area of understanding. So my reading of Mauss was very educational. A French anthropologist, 1925, who looked at gifts. The West, in its aid programs and relationship with the majority world, tends to build on thinking that has emerged from Christian theology. And I think this is something that Barclay draws on. We're secular, and we'll keep talking about Christian theology. And that, one of those aspects is, you can give a free gift without circularity. That's what the West believes. You can give and you don't get anything back. Yet, as Barclay and others have realized, this is a myth. And actually, when you give out aid and help, you generate something. You generate efforts at circularity, you generate patronage, you generate praise for you, and so forth. So, gifts set up obligations. Now, these appear to be inseparable from spiritual spheres of life. Now, that's an issue I'm just addressing now in a number of articles I've written. I think you can say gift imbalances are spirits. Now, I don't want to say that in a reductionist sense, but as an embellishment to that discussion, gift exchange imbalance are spirits. In Africa, I suggest the spiritual and the material are mutually creative. People talk about Africans and material things. In Africa, we don't, in that sense, have material things. We have material spiritual things. When we talk about not using outside resources, we're basically saying money. We're not saying you shouldn't sing, you shouldn't pray, you shouldn't use your brain. If that's an outside resource as well, that's one God has given you. But the monetary outside resources turn the foreign missionary into a gift-giving person in a context that they do not understand. Gifts set up dynamics that can easily finish missionaries, given all their ignorance and naivety of local contexts. So what I propose is a way of maintaining vulnerabilities, not giving. Even if perhaps people will hate you for it. You might be a nobody. Well, maybe that's the place to be. Active engagement in gift giving requires deep cultural knowledge and identity that a foreigner from a different worldview typically does not have. Part 3, money patronage kills. So patronage can be of different types. Money patronage, unfortunately, I like to suggest, kills other forms of patronage. A paper I wrote with Fred Lewis, 2012, indicates that. Therefore, it needs singular attention. And money patronage, to use kind of gross terms, is killing Africa, as I want to outline briefly. The West prides itself on the increasing diversity of its populations. We go to the USA or the UK, they say they're browning, and I think it's true. Is Africa whitening? Well, no. Meet a black person in the UK, probably he's lived there 30 years. Probably he's born there. Meet a white person in Kenya, probably they've been there 2 weeks. The average white person in Kenya is very ignorant. We're very good at making people wise, listen to me, but we're very poor at learning about them. Because structures built in Kenya by white people are built using patronage, whatever white people do in Kenya ends up appearing to be patronage. Magazines, I was struck when I looked at this magazine in Kenya, lots of pictures, all of them looking like Kenyans. Now in the UK we make an effort, if we have lots of pictures, we have a black, we have an Indian, we have a Chinese, we try and make it look like the UK is multicultural. But if in that Kenyan magazine you have a picture of a white person, everyone knows that's the boss. So it just had to have Kenyan pictures. So the reputation of whites as patrons prevents them from sharing anything except money. Non-money patronages are killed at birth. You'll never thrive without outside money in Africa unless in a white island. This is denying African people access to many benefits of globalization that the West is enjoying. So our tendency to rush to be patrons means our identity is as money, and anything else we might have, even intelligence, kind of gets disqualified as a result. So there's no multiculturalism in Africa. I'll come back to racism. There can be no multiculturalism because patronage by wealthy donors forces Africa to live the lie that its people are Western. Western donors give to people who they think understand them, who talk like they talk. So what we do in Africa, we talk like Westerners talk, and we give the impression that we are the way that Westerners are to keep the money flowing. But because life is built on a lie, you have to keep the foreigners at bay, because if they discover the lie, they might stop bringing the money. There's no choice but to live a lie, or donor money will dry up. So the patrons I'm looking at is the likes of Brits and Americans, who we struggle with in Kenya. Corruption is closely related to the above. As illustrated by Barclay, is operation according to the patron-client system in the contexts that are not patron-client. So someone from a patron-client culture comes to a non-patron-client culture, and they would instinctively do things, we say, that's corrupt. Our term, it's corrupt. For them, it's kind of normal. Yet truly effective action against graft is impossible, because in order to acquire funds, the same graft is concealed. So we're always dealing with corruption in Africa, but it's never actually gone, because even the government hides it, of course, to keep the money flowing. Should a foreigner set out to expose the breadth and depth of corruption, he runs the risk of being accused of being racist. Killing African languages. African people have responded faithfully to their patrons. The more powerful the patron, the more one sucks up to his every word. The West, i.e. global community, United Nations, World Bank, mission organizations, hold Africa on their little finger. Outside languages have become the norm in education because of patronage. Anyone in the times of independence who was wanting to have anything but English in Anglophone Africa got nowhere because they didn't get access to that money. This has made education into a farce of imitation. This kills thinking by African people. When the model of education being aspired to is British, as in East Africa, or let's say American, then any indigenous innovation is corruption of that system. So the best thing African people to do is to not think, just to regurgitate. Now, I mentioned that to somebody, and they gave me pushback on that. No, Jim, we have very clever black people in England. Well, yes, you do. If they manage to get their heads around how English people actually do it, which most Africans in Africa, of course, struggle to do, but that doesn't alter on the basis of the first principle that in Africa regurgitation is quality, because the best is the British and the American, and anything that is a movement away from British and American is a fall in quality. Pinsa. Yes, I was a little bit fearful of attending this conference. My fears have not yet been confirmed. if you want to throw any rotten fruit. Patron missionaries, which is most missionaries, I have to keep my distance. When I meet a missionary on the field, I can be polite, and then I have to walk away and leave them alone. Why? Because of what I'm calling the pincer. A missionary is ignorant on many things. A new missionary coming to the field in Kenya, or even a long-term missionary who hasn't been able to grasp language and culture. They're desperately searching for means to orient themselves in the strange world in which they found themselves. They have money, or they have the potential to be money. And of course, local clients are lining up, looking forward to benefiting from that money. Should I say anything contrary to the financial aspirations of those clients or potential clients, I'll be acquiring enemies and will easily be pincered out. I think this is a massive issue that has resulted in short-term mission. So you put a missionary on the field, they learn the language and they learn the culture. But nowadays we do partnership. So your boss in the UK, the African bishop also knows English, so they communicate together. Now the boss in the UK likes raising funds and is looking to someone to take their funds, and the African bishop is looking for funds to take. The boss in the UK and the African bishop are going to agree with each other. Then what's the point in having a missionary on the ground who's learned the language and the culture? Because they're going to get splattered in the middle. Any suggestion that African culture is going to interfere with the process, any suggestion that funds might not be what's needed here, well, in the UK, well, you're just a missionary. We're working with the Africans. From the African, stop interfering with the flow of funds to us. Long-term missionaries either learn to shut up or go home. Well, what's the point of having a long-term missionary if at the same time we're communicating to those people in a European language? Those people are uninformed. Anti-racism in the West. I suggest that prohibition of racism is a thinly veiled strategy aimed at denying the presence of the patron-client system amongst African and other people of majority world origins living in the West. Now, I don't think I have an instant solution to the opposition to racism, but anti-racism to me is very problematic. The fear, of course, is that should the cat come out of the bag, questions might be asked about the origins of those benefits of Western culture that arise from not following the patron-client system. Now, the reason, it seems to me, we identify the patron-client system, and we've already heard that Arabs don't have a word for patron-client. Well, we stand aside and we say, look, you're doing that, whereas the people who are doing it don't see it, because that's just who they are. In other words, the West has benefited from being not patron-client. If the results of exploration are similar to those carried out by Barclay, I hope I'm not misrepresenting him here, that Christian notions of free gift arise from Jesus' self-sacrifice for mankind, if those have underlain what the modern world West is today, that implies a need for the gospel in the contemporary world. Such a need for the gospel confounds theories of the adequacy of secularism into which the Western world has invested heavily over the last 70 years. So anti-racism is a means of trying to uphold a crumbling secularism in the West. Because if it weren't there, and we realized that actually Africans are different, why they're different, how have we in the West become what we are, then we'd have to give credit to the gospel, and that's what the secular West, of course, does not want to do. Much more could be said about anti-racism. What is being prohibited or concealed is clearly not genetic but cultural. Anti-racism is a brand of white chauvinism. If it were not so, the anti-racist norm would vary between countries and communities. So if you're in India, to be not racist would be to behave like an Indian. But anti-racism is about treating everyone like what? A Protestant-like Westerner. So it's pretending that everybody already is what we are, so as to excuse the fact that we've got the way we are by a certain historical process which involves the gospel, because people don't want the gospel. An undermining of the anti-racist agenda clearly carries many ramifications which go beyond our discussion here that focuses on patriarchy. In anti-racism, we see a massive, deceptive, patriarchal control of the West over Africa. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it seems to me, we're straitjacketed. Africans have to be treated as if they are Americans. Any diversion from that, and somebody is being accused of being racist. Part 6, the invention of world religions. The tentacles of patriarchy go far and wide. Especially in the 19th century, Western Protestant people started telling Asians who they were. That is, for example, they designed Buddhism on the basis of some obscure written texts, Alman 1988. The surprising thing should be that many Asian people were very happy to accept that label. Why were Asian people now happy to say we're Buddhist? There were no Buddhists before the British and the French invented Buddhism. Because acceptance of the label Buddhist became financially and otherwise rewarding, gave people an identity. So our scholarly predecessors, with their Protestant backgrounds investigating obscure texts in Asia, have invented an opposition to the gospel. The case of Africa is a little different. African ways of life almost universally considered inferior. It has been in African people's interest to deny being who they are. Instead, they have adopted identity as Christians and less Muslims, such that nowadays Christianity and traditional African ways of life have in many places become indistinguishable. And quite frankly, in my community, yes, they're all intermingled. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I guess it's a good thing because people have taken Christianity on board. But to contrast with that, other world religions made by Western scholars, built on foundations of patronage, what we seem to be now dealing with. Translation issues, part 7. We might note that Xerxes was careful when sending news to his provinces to write instructions in each different language, Esther 1:22. This principle seems more recently to have gone to the wind. The global system increasingly runs on one language. The injustice in such a system is enormous, particularly for those who found themselves economically compelled to adopt Western languages for official purposes. And Alexander, 1999, says, well, that's pretty much all of Africa. An issue here revolves around translation. Modern presumptions pointed to the possibility, modern presumptions, that translation between languages and cultures is possible. And it has been said that anything can be said in any language. Postmodernism, too late, realized the folly in this. The eggs are already in the one basket. Much is invested in the globalization of English, as if people chose English freely when it is a patronage of the West that increasingly forces their hand. Part 8, conference dynamics. Global conferences that run in English are represented by haves and have-nots. This obliges African delegates to play intricate games that in the end will result in their agreeing with Western agendas insofar as they preserve their financial gain. Using conferences to ascertain truth on a global scale has become a mockery. Why? Because of patronage, the patronage of the West. If patronage were the only option available to human society, we might have to simply say, well, that's morally acceptable. It appears, however, that in the West, the hegemony of patronage has been weakened. Aspects of Western life can operate other than on the basis of patriarchy. Actually, the prosperity of the West seems to have arisen through denying some or many traditions associated with patronage. For the West to relate to others on the basis of a level of patronage that it itself has put aside is surely hypocrisy, or at least deception. I believe that the West, especially because of its global power, should here be morally obligated to honesty, which requires acknowledgement of the role of the gospel in countering patronage in its history, and concomitantly a prioritizing of the gospel when it comes to advocating a way forward for others. What I'm calling here mainstreaming of Christian mission. For Western bodies not to do Christian mission is immoral because it's deceptive. Now, how that goes in today's global mix of so-called religions, and particularly the so-called Islamic world and so forth, maybe slightly different or more complex issue. Given the vast complexity of the global scene, the particular mission solution we've, in the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission, been advocating at individual level is that some Western missionaries in the majority world engage some ministry through local languages and resources. So as I understand the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission, we're saying, can there be a few? Now, I don't think we have the mega solutions, because the mega solutions need mega power. But do all the Western Christians have to play the same game as the powerful secular organizations? Or can there be a few who say, yeah, I'm going to use these people's language, I'm going to use their resources in ministry so as to be vulnerable to them rather than being Mr. Superior. On the basis that this is, if you like, the current situation. So Africa on the West on the right, what Africa says to the West, what the West says to Africa. So Africa says, we know who you are. They spend years and years of their life learning how Brits think. The West says, we don't care who you are. No interest in knowing how Africa thinks. Africa says, you have nothing to learn from us. And the West, of course, says, you have everything to learn from us. So time and time again, Westerners going to Africa to do what? Teach Africans. They're so backwards. So Africa says, we learn from you. The West says, we teach you. Africa says, we are people. The West says, we are gods. Africa says, to be like you is our dream. And the West says, to be like you is our nightmare. Africa says, we want your money. The West says, we have money for you. So information flow, Africa's the West gone wrong. Historians read into Africa that used to be like we are, now something we've done wrong, probably in colonialism. So we even blame our own colonialism for Africa's problems, so that we then become responsible for solving Africa's problems, which of course is a good patron system. Whereas Africa has to learn everything from us. So just a few points here. Point one, some Westerners are intelligent. I don't hear any denials. I believe that can be true. And those intelligent Westerners could contribute something of value to Africa if they could only get the contextual knowledge. At the moment, when you go to Africa, don't get too close to us. It's very, very difficult in Kenya to learn any African languages because English is so dominant, and they're terrified if we get close, we'll condemn them for who they are. So Westerners don't know Africa, which means neither can we use our intelligence in helping Africa. Part two, just to go a bit more quickly. A key to overcoming some of the damaging effects of patriarchy is for the West to be better informed. This requires Western people who are vulnerable to African context, i.e. vulnerable mission. Now this gets us into this issue of who is the best person to inform the West about Africa and Africa about the West. And part three, we need vulnerable Western people who relate to Africa through indigenous African languages, who operate without buying Africans into compliance to their thinking. These should be provided in the mainstream of education about Africa to the West. Part four, teaching should always be from known to unknown. Now this comes up in the book I had up there, The Goddess Delusion, and also in the novel that I put up there. I think this is an important principle. Because a teacher needs to take his students from known to unknown, the researcher should go from unknown to known. A student needs to be taught something from somebody who knows and has delved into the foreign. In other words, the person to inform the West about Africa needs to be a Westerner, which requires Westerners to be in Africa using African languages and vulnerable to African contexts. I think the reverse also applies. The person to inform Africa about the West and civilization, all those wonderful things, needs to be an African in an African language. I mean, at the moment, all the children and young people in Africa are learning about us in the way we think they ought to learn, but then we're not going from where they are. They don't understand actually what it's all about. It's just creating a castle in the sky. So there are massive implications here linguistically to try and correct what unhealthy patronage has created. Thank you very much indeed. Sidestepping Patronage with Vulnerable Mission. So I've lived in Western Kenya 25 years, previously having been in Zambia for a while, on the basis of the conviction that one or two Westerners ought to have a deep understanding of what's going on in Africa and other parts of the world, in the interests of the gospel and in the interests of relations more generally. So some of the churches I work with, the big pictures, my home church at an annual conference, and then one of the indigenous churches I visit. My ministry is basically Bible teaching, using Swahili and Lua languages, plus children who I look after there at my home, and writing and research I also engage in, plus you could say informally some hospital ministry, where in my office I'm hosted by Coptic Orthodox Church. Vulnerable mission, what is it? Westerners doing mission outside of the West, using indigenous languages and resources in ministry. So that in essence is what I find myself promoting when I'm in the Western world. Maybe in Africa we can't really talk about patronage because we are patronage, we white folks. And the other thing that's striking me that we have in Africa, which I'm not hearing about here in Lebanon, is we have mystical forces, where envy is interpreted mystically. Anyway, in this paper, I guess I'm going to state some things without full justification because of time restraints. So, sidestepping patronage with vulnerable mission. Part 1, the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission, a personal